Hello, I'm Sharlene Newman. I first want to thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I've been coming to OHBM meetings now for a number of years, off and on. I think my first meeting was the Montreal meeting in the 90s. I can't remember the year. But again, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Um, so, um, uh, when I first was invited to talk at this symposium, I decided to speak on this issue of white supremacy in neuroscience. Again, I've been coming to these conferences for a long time. Um, Early in my career as a graduate student, when I was coming to the meeting, it was not the most diverse meeting. It's still not really the most diverse meeting, but we have made a lot of progress. I think we just to give I guess, an outline of what I'll talk about. I first want to start with some definitions to make sure we're all on the same page, and then I want to talk about neuroscience and racism, really focusing on phrenology for for a brief period of time, and then talk about how white supremacy shows up in neuroscience, shows up in recruiting faculty and graduate students, and in the research itself. And then talk about some potential solutions. So, first, what is white supremacy? And I think when we first think about white supremacy, I think we all think about like violence, right? So we think about people doing all kinds of mean, I guess, things. So we think about neo Nazis, we think about the Klan, we think about the alt right. Um, but that's an extreme version of white supremacy, right? And so, again, some definitions to just put us all on the same page. First, I want to say that race is not biological, right? So it's a social construct. When we think about race, um, one of the things that if we think deeply about race, one of the things that we see is that the lines kind of are blurred between race. The boundaries aren't real clear, right? So, and that's because it's not biological. It's something that humans have made up, right? So, one example is that when we think, at least in the U.S., I mean, there's the Asians are considered a race, but that's a large group of different ethnic groups, right? So there's no real reason why they're all kind of lumped together other than for convenience of some for someone, right? So it's not biological. It is a social construct. I also want to make sure that we separate whiteness from individual people, right? So um, Ruth Frankenberg defines whiteness as a dominant cultural space, right? So it's not an individual, it's a system in some way, right? So it's a dominant cultural space that has political significance. So when we're talking about whiteness, we're not talking about people, not individual people. We're talking about this sort of concept, this sort of idea. Um, and then white supremacy. White supremacy is a belief, right? So it's a belief that the white race is superior. And I like the description that Dr. Johns provides of white supremacy, and he describes it as a virus that we all are infected with, regardless of race. And I think that's important to remember is that white supremacy, this belief system, is something that's just kind of in the air that we all breathe, and we're all infected with it. And so he describes it as supremacy says to itself that I'm supreme. That if like we're not at the center or on top or in front or first or in control, the world will fall apart. If we let them through our doors, we will sacrifice quality. Right? And so again, it's a belief. And I say that we're all infected with it, regardless of race, because even those individuals who are not white, so non-white people, believe this too, right? Because we're bombarded with messages that say this, that say that the white race is somehow superior, and that's by design in some way. But again, it's not anything that any individual currently walking the earth sort of created. It's something that's been around for a while. Um, so now that we have the definition, I want to move to talking about neuroscience and how white supremacy has really been at the foundation of early Western neuroscience, right? And so, and that's seen in phrenology, right? And so, and we can't ignore phrenology. I think sometimes we want to sort of push it aside and say, oh, phrenology is something that no one believes. Um, but some of these ideas are still around, right? And so, and I think that's important to remember, right? And so for that, so this early neuroscience work was really used to classify Africans as inferior to whites. It was used to justify the enslavement of Africans. It was used to justify the genocide of indigenous people and the taking of their land. Right. So if you can classify them as somehow subhuman, then it's easy to enslave them. It's easy to mistreat them. Right. And so that's what this was about. Um, and it was a lot of manipulation of data to support a theory to justify a behavior, right? And again, even though I think we like to say that was pseudoscience, but these ideas are still around. You can still hear echoes of this work today, and today in some published research. And so that's why it's important to understand um, this history and understand that we need to sort of root it out of neuroscience. And we also need to, as brain imagers, as people who do human brain mapping, because we've been accused of being modern day phrenologists, is something that we need to maybe take a little more seriously and really kind of think about how it's impacting the culture within our field. Mm. Um, so, how does white supremacy show up? Um, so, I want to start just having like thinking a little bit about how it shows up in the recruitment of faculty and graduate students. I think all of us who are faculty have likely heard some of these comments during the discussion of either, again, a faculty recruit or graduate student recruit, right? So when I hear things like, oh, we don't want to sacrifice quality, um, it always sort of makes me think like, what do you mean by sacrificing quality? Um, and like, and they aren't a good fit. Um, so I think thinking about what exactly do you mean by quality? Because if the candidate, and say a faculty candidate, they have a PhD, so they've gone through that process, they've published in peer-reviewed journals, then how are you sacrificing quality? Um, what do you really mean by sacrificing quality? And the same with fit. What do you mean by what do you really mean by fit? Right? Um, do you mean that they make you uncomfortable? Um, do you mean that they're not like me? And like me, what does that mean? And is the job of academia to recreate itself um, and just only hire people who are like the people who are already there? Right. So, what does fit mean? Um, and when thinking about thinking about graduate students and recruiting graduate students, I've also heard quite a bit um, the concerns around the undergraduate institution that the student attended, and relating that to whether or not they're prepared to be in graduate school at our institution, right? And a lot of times these conversations around preparedness is really related to students who attended a minority serving institution or a historically Black college or university in the U.S. Right. Um, so I think really kind of think about what you mean when you have these concerns and where those concerns are coming from. Um, and then I think this one is maybe a little different than the others because there's a lot of expectation. I think that faculty and students from underrepresented groups assimilate into the culture, right? And so we all know that the culture of academia, the culture of neuroscience, the culture of human brain mapping is a very white one, right? And so the expectation is that regardless of where you're from, that you're to assimilate and become more like that culture. Integration is not what's expected, right? So you're not expected to maintain your sort of culture, your ethnic characteristics. The expectation is that you just become and you shed all of that and become more like the dominant culture. Is that what we should be doing? What are we losing by asking people to assimilate as opposed to welcoming them to integrate into the culture? Are things that I think we need to think about as a field. So how does this show up in research? And I think here it's a for me frustrating, but I think it's also interesting to think about. So as neuroscientists, right, we understand that brains um, develop as a function of experience of the environment, right? We understand that people who have different experiences, their brains will develop in slightly different ways, right? Um, so it's experience, it's exposure, it's environment that are causing differences, these individual differences, as well as some biological factors, right? So I don't want to negate genetics, um, but it's not race, right? Because race isn't biological, but we tend to use race as a proxy, as a shorthand for other things, which makes it confusing later, right? So one example is that we see higher rates of Alzheimer's disease and dementia for African Americans, right? So why? It's not about race, right? So it's not because like my skin is darker that's causing the higher rates of dementia, right? So we we need to dig a little deeper and understand that it's like what is it about the experience of being Black in America that's causing higher rates of dementia, right? And do you see these higher rates of dementia in, say, Black people in the Caribbean or Black people in African countries? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Another example where I actually kind of looked the data up a bit is in maternal morbidity and mortality, right? So in the US, African American women have ridiculously high rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. But that's not the case for non native born Black women. They do not have the same high rate. So, what is it about the experience, the exposure? And in the case of African American women and maternal morbidity and mortality, it's not even about socioeconomic status or education, right? So there's something about the experience and understanding that is important, not race, right? So I think the thing to think about is how are we not understanding neuroscience by using race as a shortcut. And then the last example I do want to kind of mention is concussion and the way the National Football League in the US is handling um, the payouts that they're giving for people who are having cognitive um, issues as a result of concussion, right? So they're using race normed neuropsych tests, and because of those race norm neuropsych tests, they're not paying African American or Black um, NFL players who are experiencing cognitive deficits at the same rate that they're paying white players because of this race norming. So the question is, why are we doing race norming? And the rationale is because it has to do with like, well, that people from lower SES backgrounds tend to perform worse, and we need to norm the scores. But then, why are you using race as a proxy for socioeconomic status? It should not be used as a proxy for anything. Then the other question is, who determines what someone's race is, right? So do you just look at someone and say, okay, they're Black, or they're white, or they're Asian? I mean, who's making this determination about what someone's race is? And if someone's mixed race, who decides which one that is, right? And I think it's also important to just remember that the descendants of enslaved Africans, at least in the US, are all mixed race. So who decides what someone is? Again, race is not biological, it's a social construct, and this is not logical. Okay. Um, it, just to continue with thinking about how white supremacy shows up in research. So there's a lack of diversity in research groups can lead to some issues, right? So it can lead to making some not so great conclusions from results if you're looking at race, right? And so for example, just what I was just talking about in terms of race norming, right? So who makes those decisions, and why were you doing it in the first place, and why not use what we already know about the impact of of experience, of exposure, of environment, instead of using race? Is it just that we're being lazy and we don't want to go through all of that effort, and it's easier to use race, even though we know it's not accurate? But having a more diverse research group, someone hopefully will sort of say, "Hey, this doesn't make sense. Let's look at this from other perspectives and develop a fuller explanation of the results." Um, Another thing that I've just been thinking about and sort of came up after watching the documentary Coded Bias, and looking at machine learning and the biases that's embedded in a lot of the AI that's out there, particularly in terms of like face recognition, because we're beginning to use much more AI in neuroimaging. The question is, are we embedding racial bias in the work that we're doing? We know that there's a lack of diversity in the participants, which means that the samples that are being used to train these machine learning systems, they're not representative. They're sort of only sort of they're just not representative. So how is that impacting the the code? I mean, how is this impacting the work? And if you're going to use it for precision medicine or for diagnosis, how is white supremacy impacting that work? Right. Um, and so I think that's important to think about. And when I say a diversity of participants, again, this isn't necessarily about race, because again, race isn't biological. But do you have a wide sort of representation of all the different experiences and environmental exposures in your sample, or they all, and I can speak for me in my own research, because typically used like a convenient sample of college students. Those are not the most homogeneous samples that I've used, right? They are really homogeneous. They're not the most representative, right? So, college, undergraduate, freshmen, um, they're just not representative of the population. And that's no, I knew that was a bias, um, but do we all understand that that's a bias in the data? And then it definitely comes up. So white supremacy shows up in peer review as well. We and that's clear from the NIH um, funding, right? So NIH has consistently underfunded minority researchers. Regardless of everything that they've done, they still consistently underfund minority researchers. And because the determination of who gets funded is based solely on peer review, then some of this is sort of leaking into the peer review process, right? And that's just something that's clear, and we just need to accept that and try to understand how we can reduce it. And I can also speak for myself, um, not in NIH peer reviews, but in research paper peer reviews. I have only once, but I have, and I have friends who have experienced it more than I have. Um, Both gender and sort of racially charged comments in the review. So these things do happen, and they do creep in. So solutions. I don't want to sort of leave you with like, oh, um, we have a problem. What do we do? So some potential solutions, although really I don't know how to fix this problem. But I know that there's no easy fix. There's no like 5-step program, and then it's all um, inclusive and everyone's great, and no more racism and no more white supremacy. That's not how this is going to work. I think it's important to remember that we're all affected, or infected, as Dr. Johns would say, by the virus of white supremacy. So that includes you, regardless of your ethnicity. Um, we're all impacted by it, and so I think that's something to remember. Um, and I think it's important for each of us to examine and address the stereotypes that we have about other groups. We all have them. We understand stereotypes. I think most of us have a cognitive psychology background, and so we understand the what stereotypes are. We understand the importance of them, and sort of making fast decisions. We all have them, right? So, but the question is, are we aware of all of those stereotypes, and are we using the cognitive control necessary to make sure negative stereotypes aren't impacting how you're making decisions about people, right? And I think that's the part that's important, that we need to examine our own stereotypes, um, and think about where these stereotypes come from, how were they created, how are they affecting your decision making, how are they affecting how you interact with people. So, for example, thinking about whether or not you feel that it's so hard and so difficult for you to understand someone with a really thick, say, Chinese accent, but you're okay with a really thick Italian accent, right? So um why is there that huge difference depending on what type of accent? Now, of course, if you speak Italian, then of course you're more more comfortable with it. So don't use that sort of direct example, but think about another one. Um, and there are some resources to help you sort of work through some of these things, and think about them and do the self reflection. So the Me and White Supremacy workbook is I think a good one, but there are others out there as well. And so again, I think each of us as individuals must do the work to understand um, where our stereotypes come from, to understand how white supremacy may be impacting each of us, because that could be different for each of us. And I think it's also important when you're reviewing grants or recruiting graduate students or faculty to examine the criteria that you're using to judge them and then make sure that it's fair. Again, a lot of times these things that we think about when we think about quality and fit, we're not consciously thinking about um, race, but that doesn't mean that it's not there impacting your decision making. And I think it's important to make that the unconscious conscious and think about what you're doing. And I think it's also important that we all have to do our own work. So that means don't go bugging your one non-white colleague with lots of questions. You have to do your own work. And I'm just going to say for me, please don't come bugging me, asking me to help you sort of work through anything or ask me lots of questions, because I'm giving you a resource for you to work through it yourself. And this is something that, again, each of us must work through that. And when I say, the me and white supremacy, this is for everyone, including African American and other sort of Black people and non-white people. Everyone, I think, can benefit from working through that me and white supremacy workbook. I know I did when I worked through it. And I think it's important for us all to do our own work and not try to take shortcuts from doing that work, right? So we make neuroscience more inclusive. We make the brain mapping community more inclusive by each of us actually being more inclusive, right? So that's the only way we're going to change the culture. That's the only way we're going to change anything, is that each individual changes themselves. So thank you for listening to this talk. I hope you got something out of it. I like to sort of leave a talk acknowledging the people who keep me sane, and those people are my family, so my parents, and my daughter. So I'm acknowledging them here. um, Again, because they do keep me sane in this kind of crazy world, especially during the past year of this pandemic. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, or at least learned something from it.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever in the world you are. My name is Sade Abiodun, and I'm extremely honored to speak to you today on the topic of creating lasting diversity frameworks, the shift from optical to equitable as part of the OHBM 2021 Symposium on Racial Bias in Neuroscience. So I always like to start out by just giving a general introduction as to who I am and why I'm here today. So as I mentioned before, my name is Sade Abiodun. I use she, they pronouns. I just completed actually my first year at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute at Princeton University. I am very interested in the topic of neurocinematics, otherwise known as the use of naturalistic stimuli to understand more about the interactions between visual media and the brain. And aside from my academic interest in this topic, I'm also very creatively interested in film craft. I am an independent filmmaker. And all in all, I am just deeply invested in the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, both within neuroscience and academia, within film and the arts, and beyond. And one caveat that I always like to provide is that I am not, in fact, a race expert. And the fact that I'm able to speak to you today on this topic is really by virtue of the visibility that I've had as I've processed and worked through a lot of my own thoughts and experiences within the field. But none of my opinions and thoughts should be taken as definitive or sort of the sole thoughts that you should listen to on this matter. Hopefully they just contribute to a larger discussion at hand. So first, we have a question just with regards to this presentation, this topic as a whole, which is, what does it mean to challenge and subvert a framework? You know, there's a lot of buzzwords that come up when we talk about DEI work, but challenging and subverting frameworks, what does that mean? There's also, of course, the question of what a framework is. And last but not least, whether there is even a single solution. And I think all of these are very valid points and very valid questions to ask. And I don't actually think I'll answer any of them in today's presentation. I'm going to try and move away from a discussion or a conversation that has a sort of conclusive ending, and rather one that further propagates and allows for further conversation, discussion, and hopefully action. But there is one initial thought that I'd like to frame kind of our minds with as we go into the rest of the presentation, and that is this. Nothing can be deconstructed in isolation. All forms of oppression are historically and ideologically tied to one another in some way, shape, or form. And the reason that that's important to understand for this conversation in particular is that while I'm here talking to you today about the topic of racial bias in neuroscience and challenging these frameworks within neuroscience, we cannot have a proper conversation if we kind of restrict our ideas or our notions of this topic to current day academia. We have to think of the very spotty and storied history of academia and its interactions with inclusivity and exclusivity, as well as the future of the field, as well as outside of academia as a whole, experiences of real people and real individuals in a real world. Secondly, I think the best way to approach such a mission is to adopt this mindset that challenging the system of academic capital requires a mindset of academic community. And so with that in mind, that's exactly how I decided to approach this conversation. Once I was invited to give this topic or to give this talk, I immediately knew that I was severely underprepared or under-equipped to convey any of these ideas from my own experiences and my own thoughts. And so what I immediately did was that I tapped into the networks of individuals and community that I've built and have been building over the course of my time within the academy to really ask their experiences. And that spans fellow trainees, postdocs, faculty, and other professionals that exist both within and outside of the field of neuroscience that span institutions and organizations across North America. And I posed a series of questions to them, but they can really be boiled down into this main one, which is, what does creating equitable frameworks within science look like to you? And that's really the mindset or sort of the frame within which I wanted the contributions and thoughts to be generated. I also provided a set of guidelines that were very important. Just to structure sort of how input was given. The first was that no anonymity, just for the sake of being able to attribute the thoughts that were shared to the correct individuals, and you'll actually see me do that throughout the slides, but also for the sake of transparency and making it really clear that this was a conversation, this was a discussion that was being had by real people in the field who have various aspects of their identity, their experiences to contribute. Secondly, while I said that thoughts and opinions were welcome, I also asked for concrete and practical resources and ideas to move us beyond the stage of just discussing and having discourse around it to really saying, what do we need to do to change this within the academy? And lastly, while I encouraged all input, or while I said that all input was wanted, I really emphasized that the input I needed to hear was from individuals who come from backgrounds, who are from backgrounds that have been historically impacted by inequity and exclusion in academia, those who would directly benefit from equitable frameworks being in existence. And this includes, but is not limited to, many of the identities that I listed below. Of course, those just being some identities that are visible, that are being able to be seen, but also many invisible identities as well. So an overview of how I kind of took those thoughts that were generated, which were very expansive and just a very rich conversation, and boiled it down for the sake of this 15-minute presentation, it can be laid out in three main points. So first, we have this idea of equity versus equality. We then have challenging versus dismantling. And then we have shifting mindset versus shifting practice. And then I'll kind of encapsulate all those in some concluding thoughts, quote unquote. I'll also say that just for the sake of time, I will be moving through a lot of this information very quickly. I will be reading at times directly from my slides and skipping between things. But hopefully in the live discussion, we'll get to flesh out a lot more, because the ideas that came from everyone who contributed were very rich, very substantive, and deserve a lot more of a platform to be shared. But first, this topic of equity versus equality. So we've heard a lot more in more recent years, the idea of shifting away from equality and seeking equality to seeking equity and being equitable. And of course, there exists the question of why. The best way that I've sort of framed it in my own mind, and that came from this sort of contributed document, is that when we talk about equity, it's because, or we talk about equity because equality ignores these notions of historic and systemic disadvantages that are faced by marginalized groups with regards to their access and opportunity, as well as their visibility in fields. We need to take account of the fact that inviting a Black speaker to a symposium, to a colloquium is great. However, it does not ameliorate the fact that there's no POC faculty that are tenured in that department and haven't been for the last 30 years. Those aren't really equal forefronts. So understanding that there's a history behind lack of representation, lack of visibility, lack of diversity in fields is very important, and that those voices and experiences need to be uplifted. And that's exactly what equity aims to do. Secondly, there's this idea that giving a platform is enough in itself. Like I mentioned, inviting someone for a talk or for a review or for any sort of organizational or academic contribution. This is good. However, it is not sufficient. It is not sort of all-encompassing on its own. And that's mostly because of the fact that oftentimes when individuals are boosted into positions of being the diverse individual or the diverse representation in a field, that burden of representation can be overemphasized and yet undervalued. They do not receive adequate compensation. Their service work is not really contributive to their overall academic portfolio. It does not help them get tenure. And so it can really be extra work that we are putting on individuals who are already sparse in their representation in a field. And that can be very troublesome if we're not careful. Now, with regards to the question of whether we can fix it, there are two big ideas that come around. And one for me was this idea of the leaky pipeline. And if you haven't heard about the leaky pipeline, it's essentially that as you move through various stages within the academy, there's less and less diversity, less and less representation, to the point where there's actually just not enough diverse or marginalized groups or minorities to recruit and to have in these positions. I won't necessarily speak to my personal thoughts on the leaky pipeline sort of phenomena or that idea. However, with this idea of the leaky pipeline, whether or not it does exist, whether or not we really want to buy into it, it is still in itself an imperfect excuse and shifts the blame for this lack of representation towards the individuals who do not elect to stay or follow the academic trajectory, rather than asking and really challenging why they did not feel like they could stay or remain in this field in the first place. And that's likely because of the certain structures around kind of academic loyalty, having very little incentivized monetary compensation for a very, very large workload, and in general, just hostile environments and the like. There are very much infrastructural reasons for individuals to not want to stay in the academic field, and those should be addressed before we use the leaky pipeline as an excuse as to why we aren't diverse enough. And then there's also this question of, do diversity initiatives work? We've seen an uptick in popularity or in visibility of diversity symposia, colloquia, platforms, workshops, and the like, syllabi and the like. But asking if they work is in itself the wrong question. And I think that's really important to say, because it's less about the work that's being done, or sorry, it's less about if they work, whatever that means. Any sort of engagement in these conversations is very important. It's more so a matter of whether or not we are, at the same time as giving platforms and space for these type of workshop things, still challenging sort of the action and accountability from a top-down level, the powers that be, departmental heads, funding organizations, and the like, as well as giving proper acknowledgement and, as I've mentioned before, compensation to the efforts of laborers who are pushing these efforts from the bottom up. So next we move on to the question of challenging versus dismantling. And when I say challenging versus dismantling, I'm really talking about in the sense of the academic tradition. So the first question that comes up is tradition bad? Should we kind of throw out all of these notions and ideas of academic ideology and culture because we keep referring to it as this old boys club and the like? And what I'll say to that is that tradition is not inherently bad. However, it is worth examination if that tradition is one that works for the institution more than the individuals that comprise that institution. And I'll actually expand on that point in a little bit. But next, I want to dive into sort of this idea of what is our tradition within academia. And I'll be speaking, of course, with regards to neuroscience or even more broadly, STEM fields. So first, we have a notion of elitism in academic competition, where you see institutions competing for resources, for publications, for faculty and the like. There's very much this idea of racing to do things. Publish or perish mentality and ideas also fall into this category. And what this really emphasizes as sort of a culture is that it drives notions of exclusion and toxic mindset around hyperproductivity and work-life balance. publish-repairist mindsets are not sustainable for any individual, but very much so also for individuals who have additional important matters or important elements to their identity, life, and experiences aside from their academic identity. So it really does push them to the edge of whether it be wanting a family, whether it be needing to take care of family, whether it be for completely and totally individual reasons. It can make it very difficult to sustain sort of a rhythm and flow within the academy with that mindset. Secondly, we have the idea of hierarchical structure and academic capitalism. So this idea that you have the structure of PI to postdoc, to grad students, to RAs, to undergrads. And you see sort of those structures existing in various ways. And while that can be good in some ways, it can also enable very toxic power dynamics and protection of power over people. In the case where the power is with an individual who does not want to acknowledge or is not aware of the harm that they could be doing to their trainees. And lastly, there's an idea of the restriction and lack of transparency in resources, whether that be knowledge, data, information, or funding as well. And all in all, this perpetuates the notions of inaccessibility and the culture of thankless labor, when you're not actually getting to know who is doing the work, what is being done, why they're doing it, how they were doing it. It really creates sort of a black box mentality, which makes it very difficult to hold powers that be accountable. And kind of going back to the first point that I mentioned with regards to this discussion of tradition, I would just like to simply say that meritocracy and elitist culture are both counterintuitive to equitable frameworks. They're inherently fueled by exploitative supremacist ideologies, and we simply cannot worship and uphold a toxic rigor structure with minimal compensation in academia, while also making a conscious effort, or saying that we're making a conscious effort to diversify the field. Those two are not compatible. And that brings me to my last point, this idea of shifting mindset versus shifting practice. Because in all of the things that we're talking about, they can generate a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings, a lot of opinions, a lot of great discussion. But what does it mean to practically change the way that our frameworks, our ideas, our kind of community is structured? I'd like to say to this first and foremost that actions speak loud. They definitely speak louder than words. And discussing these shifts in mindset and culture matter a lot. It's very important to open these sort of dialogues and the like. However, they are nothing if they stay as talk without being followed through by practical, substantive, sustainable action. And I'd like to say that that is a very important point to emphasize from the bottom up, of saying that individuals should kind of buy into the idea of doing the work to make their environments more equitable and more inclusive. However, this also very much has to come from the top down, from organizations, from funding groups, from institutions, to really say, what are you doing to make it clear that you are committed to equity and inclusivity in your institution, in your environment? So here are some practicals with regards to how that could take shape. First, we have funding. So challenging the devaluation of work, funding efforts, funding scientists and funding advocates. Do not allow work to go done with, let work happen without adequate compensation, under incentivized and the like. We have the idea of teaching, so allowing for an ethical awareness of pedagogical structure being a fundamental aspect of being a good mentor, a good researcher, a good scientist, rather than an optional aspect. Really understanding that we need to train PIs, postdocs, and grad students to spread their science widely, to spread their science ethically, and also very considerably. We also just need to broaden in general. I talked a little bit before about the idea of decentralizing, deconstructing, and I think decentralizing power is a very important step to making sure there's both accountability as well as transparency in a lot of the processes that are going on within the academy. And that could come in the form of multi-mentorship models, where a single trainee will have multiple outlets and also multiple points of input as to how their particular science trajectory is going. This can also take form in the structure of departments as well as many other forms. But I think just this idea of decentralization of power. And then lastly, opening science, opening funding information, opening demographics for departments, opening and making it very clear that there is no sort of like secretive, underwritten, unspoken syllabi within the academy for you to succeed and survive. And that again being a point that is for the sake of both accountability and access. So in conclusion, there really is no conclusion. And as I alluded to before, I think this is an ongoing conversation, an ongoing discussion, and also requires generations and generations of action to take place. It's not just about addressing it in this moment, in this time, but rather taking account of the history as well as taking account of the future. As I said, these conversations are continuous, generational, and require more than partial attention. The only time that we are talking about DEI work should not be at DEI workshops. It should be integrated and incorporated into the very minutiae and the very culture and ideology of us as academics. We also have to move away from the mindset that DEI serves or saves the marginalized or the underrepresented. DEI serves everyone. That challenges very directly this notion of creating diversity because diversity makes a field better. That in itself is a very meritocratous mindset and feeds into sort of the notions of toxic academic capitalism. We do this work because it's the right thing to do, and we do this work because it makes the field as a whole more equitable for everyone. And also, last but not least, just thinking of the we, the I, and the you. So moving away from sort of separating ourselves as individuals from this conversation and this discussion, but really centering, or not centering ourselves, but centering the idea that we contribute very actively in our day-to-day interaction, in our day-to-day work to the infrastructure and kind of the culture of a field. And we have the power to change that as individuals, as communities, and also as institutions, as we are part of the larger academic body. And with all of that said, I'd like to thank you all so much for listening, and I'd like to thank each and every person who contributed to this conversation from the bottom of my heart. I really am grateful for all of you, and I'm very excited to see where the discussion moves to beyond here. Thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Yakeel Quiroz, Associate Professor at the Harvard Medical School and the Director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Multicultural Alzheimer's Prevention Program and the Familial Dementia Neuroimaging Lab. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to share my experience with mentoring Latino investigators as part of the roundtable and diversity. So I'm going to start with this phrase, like, don't wait for the opportunity. Like, sometimes you have to create opportunity. And this is based on my experience in the past few years. So just to start, so I'm actually originally from Colombia, and I went to college in the late 90s. And as part of my working in Colombia, I actually had the opportunity to work with Dr. Francisco Lopera in the characterization of what we know as the largest extended family with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And as part of this work, we actually have the opportunity to characterize these families and the genetic mutations that explain the form of the disease. And even then, it was very clear to me that there were not a lot of opportunities for us to actually train in neuroscience. I'm being very passionate about the brain as I was then and still am. That was a problem for me because, it was something that we needed to do about it. That was the first thing that I noticed, that we needed to do something. So there was no formal training in neuroscience for the students. So together with some other students, we actually created a group to fix that problem. So we created Synapsis, that is in Spanish is Grupo Synapsis, that it was a student. When we actually invited some professors from the different departments in the university to come to teach us about neuroscience. And believe it or not, we actually created this group in 1999, and the group is still working. So we started with college students, and then a few years later, we actually took it to high school students, and then we brought the high school students to elementary school, and it's still going. So pretty much creating opportunities for the students to get that training in neuroscience. Just moving forward, not opportunities for us to get PhD training at that time either. So some of us actually immigrated to the States. Just forward in time, so my group actually was the first one to characterize the brain imaging markers and other biomarkers in these families. We were the ones to help these families to get ready for clinical trials. And in 2019, we actually reported one case. There was kind of like a groundbreaking finding with a protective mutation also from these families as well. So in the process, the Senate has been, and you will see the pattern right now, creating opportunities, not just for myself, but also for others to actually advance in their careers and also get the training that is not there for them. And I think that this is something as Latinos, especially here in the States, but also anywhere, we have to look for those opportunities, or as I mentioned, just create those opportunities. Just to give you an example, I'm in creating these opportunities in 2014. As a neuropsychologist at Mass General Hospital, I created the multicultural neuropsychology program. In 2017, founded the Diversity and Disparities Professional Interest Area at the Alzheimer's Association Professional Society to promote the diverse investigators working in diversity in Alzheimer's disease. In 2018, founded the Multicultural Alzheimer's Prevention Program, or MAP, designed to promote multicultural research and also multicultural investigators. I launched also the MAP Summer Scholars Program, and in 2019, the MAP rounds to promote the research done by diverse scholars, and also to bring diverse scholars to Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. In 2020, founded the MAP Youth Ambassadors, that is similar to the program that the Synapses group that pretty much training in diverse high school students in brain science. And this is local high school students from the less privileged high school students in Boston and surrounding neighborhoods. And it's like trying to create opportunities for those that otherwise they wouldn't have access to these opportunities. And you probably already got the idea and these opportunities for others to advance advanced careers. The other piece there that is also a challenge and an opportunity at the same time is to build a support system and not just have the opportunities there, but also trying to create this system that can actually stay there for a longer time. And it goes along with surrounding yourself or surrounding ourselves with people that actually get it, right? So you know that we have some challenges that not everybody faces, but we also know that not everybody actually gets those challenges. We cannot expect that everybody understands what it means to be bilingual. No, we cannot understand that. We cannot expect that everybody will understand what it means to be the main provider or a family, for instance. We cannot expect that what it means that everybody will understand what it means to have family here and family in Colombia, what it means to have. We cannot expect that everybody will understand everything. So like just surround yourself with people that actually get it. I think that is very important. And it goes with that, like, you know, your culture. It's actually part of your brand. And not everybody actually get that. So like going here and just gonna use this image as an example, because it's one of the struggles, you know, like writing a grant proposal is already challenging, no matter the language that you speak or your first or primary language. But writing a grant proposal when English is not your first language, take it to a different level of difficulty. And you want to be writing a grant proposal or a fellowship application or a publication or a dissertation in a very supportive environment, in an environment that actually gets it, an environment that knows that is hard, and an environment that actually allows you to ask for help if you need it, without telling you that there is something wrong with you. I think that that's part of the message here. I have been trying to create that in my lab, and I think that that's part of the message here as well. You need to be in an environment that you feel that you are comfortable asking for help. So one of my lab manager last week that we were interviewing research assistants actually said that working here in the lab feels like running a family business. And I think that was actually quite special. Hearing that was quite special to me because for me shows that that pretty much shows that we actually care. And I think that's a reminding that whatever place you choose, just make sure that you choose a place with colleagues that actually care about you. A place that you feel welcome, that you feel accepted, that you feel respected. So when it's time for you to have your own lab, you go and you create a lab culture that actually promotes those values. A place that care about you, not a place that just uses you, a place that needs you, not a place that actually cares about you, and a place that nurtures you. I think that that's the main message there. There are some resources that I just wanted to make you aware in case that you don't know. So one is the National Research Mentoring Network. It's a free resource that, this is the main link. You can join. Doesn't matter the stage that you are. You can get a mentor or several mentors. I think that it's always good to have mentors that you can rely on. So I encourage you to use it. I was there as a mentee, now as one of the mentors. It's always a good idea to connect. I was also a part of this excellent program. I cannot recommend it enough. It's the summer program in Neuroscience, Excellent and Success. You get excellent mentors, and more than the mentors, you actually get you get like a friends for life and support a network that's recommended. Check it out. The other excellent program is the Neuroscience Scholar Program of NSP from the Society for Neuroscience. Also excellent mentors and career development workshops and support. So also another opportunity to connect and start familiarizing yourself with all the different funding opportunities. Like as you want to advance your career, especially in science, you are gonna need funding. As I was saying before, like the sooner you start working on those applications, the better a chance you have to get feedback and support from mentor and colleagues. There are a lot of people that are there willing to help you with your applications. So get familiar with that as well. This is actually taken from the SFN website that I show you, but you can get more information at NIH as well. So reach out to these program officers as well if you have any questions. Networking is key. This is one of the big opportunities, especially now that we have kind of like going visual and people are more open to schedule like Zoom meetings and stuff. If you ever want to connect with anybody, feel free to send emails, or if you don't know who to connect with, I will be more than happy to respond any inquiries you have by email or helping you to find a connection if you don't know who to connect with, or I'm also available in Twitter if you want to reach out to Twitter as well. And once you establish a connection with somebody, just don't leave it there. Try to stay in touch, and that's the main thing here. Stay connected, especially in science. It's not like a one-time connection. You're going to be working in science, hopefully, for a long time. We want to hear about you. We want to learn about your progress. So stay connected. And, as I was saying, we want you to succeed. We want to hear your story. So stay in touch. And this is the information to stay in touch with me, getting in contact. This my email, my website, and Twitter, and I will be more than happy to hear from you, even in the discussion or later on. And thank you so much for your attention and the opportunity to share with you today. Have a good day.